In the quiet hours, history breathes in whispers. Stay with us, and let its stories guide you through the dark into the dawn. You settle in, the room dim and kind, and your mind reaches for stories that calm the breath even as they spark quiet wonder. If you're here, it's because history helps you drift, truth wrapped in candlelight. If that sounds like you, stay close. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time your night begins. It's oddly soothing to know this small campfire circles the globe. Now let the fan hum, pull the blanket to your shoulders, and let's wander into chambers where crowns gleamed, curtains whispered, and choices echoed for centuries. Joanna of Naples took her throne in 1343 and treated tradition the way an artist treats a sketch. Useful, but not sacred. For marriages in a lifetime didn't shock her world. The pace and politics did. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, died early, found strangled near a garden, an accident on paper that satisfied no one. Whispers bloomed faster than roses. Did Joanna order it? Most evidence won't go that far. Her enemies gladly did. A darker legend later stuck to her name. A trapdoor under the royal bed, a theatrical solution for lovers who outstayed their welcome. Pulled by a lever, dropped to the moat, cleaned from memory as easily as silk sheets are changed. It's delicious gossip and almost certainly fiction, but you see why it clings. It matches the mask people wanted her to wear. What is certain is calmer and sharper. Joanna navigated papal fury, Angevin rivalries, and Neapolitan factionalism with an eye like a jeweler. Cool, precise, unhurried. She backed the Avignon papacy when it suited stability, pivoted when storms shifted, and wore elegance like armor. Admirers called her gracious. Critics called her dangerous. The truth is that she understood the cost of ruling when men expected a figurehead and got a strategist. In 1382, she was likely strangled on orders of a cousin claimant who wanted what she held. Even in death, the rumor mill kept turning, and that tells you something essential about power. People fear what won't apologize for existing. Then there's Eleanor of Aquitaine, who didn't merely inhabit the 12th century. She arranged it. Duchess in her own right, first Queen of France, then Queen of England, and eventually mother to two kings, Richard and John. She moved like weather. You didn't stop her. You adapted. At 15, she married Louis VII of France, devout and gentle, yet mismatched with a bride whose wit and wealth filled rooms. On the Second Crusade, he sought relics and penance. She brought musicians and a hawk's attention for strategy. Rumors swirled around her easy friendship with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, talk that said more about anxious courtiers than proven scandal. What did happen is clear. The marriage frayed under distance, dust, and wildly different callings. After the annulment, Eleanor didn't merely return to Aquitaine. She steered her life like a ship catching a long-awaited wind. She married Henry Plantagenet, 11 years younger, red-headed, brilliant, and kinetic, the future Henry II of England. Their union produced 10 children and enough political static to power a continent. At Poitiers, Eleanor fostered poetry and the refined theater of courtly love. Knights practicing discipline of heart and tongue, ladies setting terms with intelligence and poise. It was an ideal more often sung than obeyed, but ideals shape behavior even when they're playfully broken. When Henry's restlessness turned cruel and her grown sons reached for their own crowns, Eleanor chose blood over bitterness and backed a rebellion. He caged her for 16 years, castle comforts, yes, but confinement still. She endured, wrote, planned, aged into a keener version of herself, and emerged a stateswoman. If Joanna shows you elegance as strategy, Eleanor shows you endurance as policy. Now breathe slower, because the next chamber is quieter and colder. Margaret of Burgundy entered history as a model princess. Neatly married to the future Louis X of France, faultlessly presented. The sort of woman the chroniclers barely noticed until they had a reason to look. That reason arrived in 1314, when the French court discovered that 3 royal daughters-in-law, Margaret among them, had not been living the blank, pious lives expected of them. What we call the Tour de Nesle affair began with a simple, devastating question. Where did those embroidered purses come from, and who had the nerve to gift them? Servants talked. Lovers were named. Humiliation moved through Paris like winter fog. Punishments fell hard. 2 accused knights were executed. Margaret was imprisoned in a fortress whose stones remembered every footstep. Her marriage to Louis, already pale and heirless, never recovered. When he became king, she did not rise beside him. She died young, in custody, the official explanations neat and unsatisfying. If this feels harsh, that's because it was. Medieval courts could forgive 1,000 political sins before forgiving a woman who refused to be invisible. Margaret's lesson is not lurid. It's human. In rigid systems, the private self becomes a battlefield, and rumor is a weapon you cannot see until it lands. As you drift, notice a pattern linking these queens across centuries and borders. None of them were simple. Each learned that a crown is lighter than it looks and heavier than anyone admits. Joanna teaches you that reputation is a stage you do not control. So anchor to reality and let slander burn itself out. Eleanor teaches you that time is an ally if you let it be, that confinement can sharpen purpose, that influence often ripens after the world stops watching. Margaret teaches you to read the room when the room is armed, to understand that choices in private can become verdicts in public, and that fairness and survival aren't always invited to the same table. You don't need to chase scandal to learn from it. Let the fan keep singing. Let your eyes soften. History, at its gentlest, is a companion that sits at the foot of the bed and says, "Here is how others moved through impossible rooms." If you feel a little stronger, a little wiser, that's enough for tonight. And if you want more journeys like this, quiet, true, and a touch dangerous, tap subscribe only if it genuinely comforts you to return. Tell me where you're listening from, who you are when the house is still, and what stories you want next. For now, breathe. The queens will keep their watch while you sleep. You settle deeper into your chair, the kind of posture that says you're ready for a slow-burning story. Tonight's path winds through towers, whispered meetings, and choices that shook thrones. These are queens who understood that in medieval courts, the smallest detail could unravel a life or crown it in legend. Keep your breathing easy, your mind open, and let the hum of the night carry you through each chamber we enter. Margaret of Burgundy began as the model of royal composure. Married to the future King Louis X, draped in fur-trimmed gowns, polite in public and harmless on paper. But in 1314, her name became part of the Tour de Nesle scandal, a tale that reads like a medieval stage play written for maximum intrigue. She and her sister-in-law Blanche were accused of secret meetings with 2 Norman knights, encounters that took place in a secluded tower on the Seine. The setting was perfect for discretion. Stone walls, high windows, and shadows that seemed to guard more than they revealed. The affair might have remained rumor, if not for a mistake so small it feels almost unreal. The knights were spotted using luxury pillowcases identical to those in the princess's chambers. That detail, linen, not letters, became the thread that pulled the whole tapestry apart. Royal servants whispered, the king listened, and the scandal moved like fire in dry hay. Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law, ordered a brutal display. The knights tortured, executed, their fates sealed in the town square for all to witness. Margaret's own punishment was quieter but colder. She was sent to Chateau Gallard, a fortress whose beauty masked a bitter chill. 2 years later, she was gone. Accounts differ on whether it was illness, suffocation, or a husband eager to be free before his coronation. Her downfall wasn't born of treason or war, but of the wrong company in the wrong place, and in medieval France, that was enough to erase a queen's place in the story. Then there was Isabella of France, whose life proves that not all royal marriages end in quiet misery. She had the crown, the status, the jewels, everything except a husband's affection. Edward II of England was striking to look at, but his devotion leaned toward his favorites. The first was Piers Gaveston, a knight as flamboyant as he was politically tone-deaf. Edward showered him with titles, lands, and a closeness that made courtiers whisper and Isabella glare. At the coronation banquet, Gaveston wore more jewels than the queen herself, a silent insult that needed no words. When Gaveston fell to the wrath of disapproving nobles, Edward turned his loyalty to Hugh Despenser, whose greed was so consuming it spilled into every corner of the kingdom. Despenser seized lands, humiliated Isabella publicly, and drove her allies into exile. By 1326, she'd had enough. Under the guise of diplomacy, Isabella left for France with her son, the future Edward III. There she met Roger Mortimer, a nobleman whose defiance matched her own, and together they plotted what few queens would dare, the invasion of their own realm. It worked. Edward II was captured, deposed, and imprisoned. His death remains a shadowed mystery. Tales of brutality still swirl, though many historians believe the most graphic accounts were shaped by rumor rather than fact. Isabella ruled as regent beside Mortimer until her son took the throne and removed them both from power. Her punishment was far gentler than Margaret's, comfortable seclusion for the rest of her life. She entered history as a queen consort but left it as a strategist whose will reshaped a kingdom. And then, Agnes of Navarre, a woman born into a world where words could be weapons and alliances were as delicate as glass. The daughter of a king and sister to a queen, she grew up in courts that prized poetry and subtle maneuvering. She married into the crown of Aragon, her husband James IV being the grandson of James II. From the outside, it was a match of prestige. Inside, it was a storm. James's erratic behavior, less the brilliance of a mad poet, more the paranoia of a ruler at war with his own mind, turned their marriage into a maze of tension. Agnes, like many women in gilded cages, sought comfort elsewhere. The Whispers named knights, courtiers, musicians, even a monk who failed spectacularly at vows. Whether the list was truth, exaggeration, or weaponized gossip, it added a dangerous weight to her name. In a court where every glance was measured and every friendship suspect, she walked the narrow line between survival and scandal. As you drift toward sleep, notice what threads these stories together. It isn't just the crowns or the castles. It's the unyielding truth that power and danger often share the same bed. Margaret teaches you that even the smallest oversight can be fatal in a world hungry for spectacle. Isabella shows that patience can turn into calculated rebellion, and that retreat can be the first step toward victory. Agnes reminds you that when trapped in a life designed by others, the heart often seeks its own dangerous map. Keep these lessons close as you rest tonight. History is not only dates and battles. It is choices made behind closed doors, secrets carried in linen, and courage found in unlikely places. The towers, the banquets, the whispered meetings, they all fade into the same quiet truth. To live in such a world was to master the art of survival. And now, as the night holds you, let their shadows guard your dreams. You lean back, letting the weight of the day drift away, because tonight's path takes you into the lives of queens who lived where power and peril were often separated by no more than the width of a silk curtain. Their stories don't just belong to dusty archives. They breathe, they linger, and they remind us that history is made as much by whispers as by wars. Agnes of Navarre was not merely elegant. She was fluent in the unspoken rules of attraction, a skill that, in the court of Aragon, could be more useful than any Latin prayer. Yet castles are not as silent as they seem. Their stone corridors carry murmurs further than intended. Soon, her private life became a topic more discussed than scripture. There was never a public trial, no forced confession, but shadows gathered around her name. Rivals fell, servants disappeared, and one unlucky courtier met the moat in a way that seemed too coincidental. Was she the cause? The records never prove it, but the kitchens began locking their spice cabinets whenever she passed. Her husband's death came, surprisingly, without her hand in it. Tradition led her to a convent, but it wasn't repentance that took her there. Convents were where noblewomen could quietly outlive their controversies. Agnes never remarried, perhaps because no one dared to ask, or perhaps because she had finally found a place where no one pried. She left no heirs, but she left a legend, a faint rustle in the halls of memory, a caution tucked between the lines of courtly verse. Then there is Joanna of Castile, a princess by blood, a queen by law, and a woman whose devotion to her husband blurred the line between love and obsession. She married Philip of Burgundy, known as the handsome not for courtesy, but because his looks were the sort that turned heads across courts. He had golden hair, striking calves, and the kind of smile that promised charm without responsibility. Joanna fell for him completely, Their passion burned bright, until his loyalty flickered elsewhere. Philip's infidelity grew bolder, and Joanna met it with fiery outbursts and relentless confrontation. But in 1506, fate intervened. Philip died suddenly, the official cause a chill after a game of ball, a thin explanation even for the 16th century. Her grief was not quiet mourning. Joanna ordered his coffin opened again and again to ensure no one had stolen him. She kissed his lifeless face, barred other women from approaching, and traveled across Castile with the coffin beside her, staying in monasteries, sometimes sleeping in the same room or closer. Rumors filled the silence where chroniclers hesitated to write plainly. Her father, Ferdinand, eventually declared her unfit to rule, confining her in a convent for the remaining 46 years of her life. Was she truly unwell, or simply a woman unwilling to release the man who had wounded her most? History offers no clear answer, only the image of a queen remembered more for her vigil over the dead than for any decree she made among the living. And then Catherine the Great. Technically beyond the medieval age, yet her life holds a density of scandal too striking to ignore. She began as a minor German princess, marrying into Russian royalty, only to find her husband, Peter III, more invested in toy soldiers and foreign sympathies than in his wife or his empire. Where her marriage offered no partnership, Catherine crafted her own path. She took lovers, officers, nobles, poets, each relationship calculated, each alliance rewarded with land, titles, or pensions. Impress the empress and you might leave with an estate. Fail and exile was never far. One lover was just 18 when Catherine was 60, a fact that still startles some but, in truth, speaks more to her command of charm and presence than to any impropriety. She was strategic, never careless. Through these connections, she built influence that was personal and political at once, consolidating her power until she ruled not as a consort, but as an empress in her own right. As you listen, notice how these women, Agnes, Joanna, Catherine, carved their names into history through choices the world judged, feared, or envied. Agnes shows the danger of beauty in a place where envy moves like poison. Joanna reveals how love, once unbound, can consume the mind as fully as it warms the heart. Catherine proves that scandal can be reshaped into strategy, that the same whispers meant to weaken a name can, if handled well, crown it in authority. So tonight, let their stories keep you company. In the quiet, they remind you that history is not only about the wars men fought in armor. It is also about the battles women waged in velvet and candlelight, where a look could be sharper than a blade and a secret more powerful than an army. And as you drift towards sleep, remember, every great court held a queen who knew that survival was an art, and her own life, the masterpiece. You listen now as the night deepens, the air turning softer, the stories sharper. We're stepping into a part of history where rumor became a weapon, and truth had to wrestle for breath. Some of these queens were loved, some feared, some endlessly misunderstood, but all of them left a mark that could not be washed away, even by centuries of retelling. Catherine's final scandal wasn't something she did, it was something invented. Long after her reign, enemies and idle gossips spun a tale so grotesque it should have collapsed under its own absurdity. That she had died during an act with a horse. The anatomy alone should have cleared her name instantly, but it didn't. Why? Because Catherine was a woman who ruled without a man, who told the church to keep its distance, who crushed rebellions and remade laws. Her competence was threat enough. The myth simply gave her detractors a more salacious arrow to shoot. In truth, she died of a stroke, fully dressed, with no animals in sight. Still, the lie clung to her name, not because it was true, but because scandal is more intoxicating than fact. She never rode a horse in the way they claimed, but she did ride history until it was hers to command. And if Catherine's story shows you the venom that power attracts, Fredegund of Neustria shows you what happens when venom fights back. Born a servant, she climbed to the queen's seat with a mixture of cunning and danger sharp enough to cut glass. Her path to King Chilperic I's side was marked by the mysterious deaths of his first wives. Tragedies she denied with the practiced poise of someone who could hold a pillow in her hands and smile as if it were a bouquet. Once crowned, she didn't put away the edge that got her there. She kept a knife beneath her pillow, not as a metaphor, but as part of her nightly routine. Fredegund's reign was soaked in political blood. Rivals were poisoned, troublesome bishops vanished, and her feud with Brunhilde of Austrasia burned across decades. This was no quiet courtly rivalry, it was an arms race in silk gowns. Fredegund even dispatched an assassin to kill Brunhilde's son during a church service, making it clear she didn't believe in sacred spaces when it came to settling scores. After Chilperic's own suspicious death, she ruled as regent for her son Clothar II, crushing uprisings and outmaneuvering enemies with the same precision she brought to her private wars. Somehow, she died peacefully in bed, a serene ending that feels almost like a clerical error in the bloody script of her life. Fredegund wasn't just a queen with a blade. She was the blade. Then comes Anne Boleyn, whose life was a lesson in how magnetism can be both a crown and a noose. She arrived at the English court in the early 1500s not with the demure grace expected of a lady-in-waiting, but with a confidence that turned heads and shifted the room's center of gravity. She wasn't the classic beauty of her day, but she possessed that rare, unnerving quality of making others aware they were being measured. Henry VIII noticed her, and promptly forgot the existence of his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and had no interest in being anyone's mistress. She set her sights higher, insisting on a crown. Henry chased her for years, writing letters that swung between passion and obsession. He broke England from Rome to annul his first marriage and place a ring on Anne's hand, a move that was less a love story and more a political earthquake. As queen, Anne was as outspoken as she was ambitious. She challenged courtiers, teased the king, and refused to play the silent consort. But when she failed to produce a male heir, giving him only a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later outshine them all, her charm began to sour in Henry's eyes. The rumors came fast and brutal. Adultery, incest, witchcraft. The accusations were poison tipped with politics, designed to strip away not just her crown but her humanity. For Anne, the rise had been swift and dazzling. The fall was swifter still. These women, Catherine, Fredegund, and didn't live in a world that allowed them quiet victories. They were targets for whispers, and yet they wielded the same whispers when they had to. Catherine teaches you that even lies can shape a legacy when the truth is inconvenient to those in power. Fredegund shows that fear, when sharpened into action, can hold a throne as firmly as loyalty, and reminds you that ambition and defiance, in a court built to silence women, can be both the making and unmaking of a queen. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the chambers they walked, tapestries hiding secrets, candles lighting faces that smiled while they plotted. History remembers them not because they fit the mold, but because they shattered it, and in doing so, left pieces sharp enough to still cut through the centuries. Let the hum of the night soften, and let their shadows stand watch while you rest. You settle in, the night stretching quietly around you, ready for another turn through the corridors of history, where crowns are heavy, choices are dangerous, and words can cut deeper than steel. Tonight, the queens we meet teach us that survival is not always about grasping the throne. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step back, when to speak, and when to walk away entirely. And Boleyn's story closed with a blade, but it wasn't her sharp tongue or ambition alone that sealed her fate. It was a king who had grown restless and wanted an exit that would remind everyone who held the power. The charges against her were as flimsy as they were theatrical, her trial more performance than justice. And when the sentence came, Henry sent for a French swordsman, a touch of elegance to mask the brutality, and lost her crown, her life, and yet, not her place in history. She remains the woman who dared to refuse before she accepted, who turned courtship into conquest, and paid the ultimate price for it. But not all queens walked into danger. Christina of Denmark understood that the surest way to keep your head was to keep it far from the chopping block. Born into royalty in 1521, she was married young to the Duke of Milan. When he died soon after, she found herself in the enviable position, rare for a noblewoman, of being both wealthy and unbound. Then came Henry VIII, newly single, famously impatient, and already down one wife whose blood was barely dry. Christina was approached as a potential bride, her likeness painted and sent for the king's inspection. Her answer became legend. "If I had two heads, I would gladly offer one to the King of England." In one sentence, she wrapped rejection, wit, and self-preservation into something immortal. Henry, predictably, ignored the sting and pursued her anyway, but Christina had no interest in becoming wife number 3 or execution number 3. Instead, she chose a calmer path, marrying a duke who didn't see marriage as a prelude to trial, and lived a long life, ruling wisely as regent and even dabbling in military matters. She proved that sometimes the greatest power lies in the crown you refuse. Maria of Portugal's story is less about avoidance and more about the long shadow of resentment. Married to Alfonso XI of Castile, she was expected to smile for the court while her husband openly adored another woman, Leonor de Guzman. Leonor bore him 10 children, while Maria gave him the legitimate heir, Peter, who history would call the Cruel. After Alfonso's death, Maria returned to Portugal with her son, clinging to him with an intensity that some historians call protective, and others call something far stranger. When Peter married Inés de Castro, his longtime mistress, Maria's disapproval was absolute. Some say it was politics, others say it was jealousy. Whatever the reason, the match was doomed. Inés was assassinated, perhaps with Maria's quiet blessing. Peter's grief was a storm. He declared Inés his lawful wife after her death, had her body exhumed, placed upon the throne, and forced the court to pay homage by kissing her hand, still wearing the marks of the grave. Whether Maria ordered Inés's death or not, her name lived on in the whispers that followed. In her later years, she withdrew from the world, sometimes calling herself an empress in private, staring for long hours through palace windows, writing letters that no one answered. Her life was a reminder that even without direct proof, the shadow of suspicion can be as enduring as any title. So what ties these women together? And who dared? Christina, who declined? Maria, who lingered in the gray space between love and power, is that each shows a different form of mastery over fate. Anne's was bold and costly, Christina's was shrewd and subtle, Maria's was tangled in love, loss, and legacy. As you let the room grow still, think of them not only as queens in distant centuries, but as women who navigated worlds designed to limit them. Some stepped into the fire, some stepped aside, but all left footprints that history still follows. And perhaps that's the truest crown of all, choosing the story you leave behind. You sink into the quiet, letting the shadows of history take shape around you, each one carrying a face, a crown, and a story that is both truth and legend. Tonight, the queens we meet are not gentle rulers in silk. They are storms, fire, and steel wrapped in royal robes. Maria of Portugal never found the love she craved, but she mastered the art of living inside a palace where every glance was a move in an endless game. Her life became a tapestry of gossip, intrigue, and whispered blame, earning her the title, fair or not, of the most formidable mother-in-law in her kingdom's history. Then comes Olga of Kiev, whose tale begins in blood and ends in sainthood. When her husband, Prince Igor, was murdered in 945 by the Drevlians, tied to trees and torn apart, they made a fatal mistake, assuming his widow would quietly mourn. Instead, Olga wrapped her grief in patience, smiled at their marriage proposal, and began a campaign of vengeance so methodical it reads like a grim folktale. First came the envoys, welcomed warmly, only to be buried alive while still seated in their boats. Then more nobles, lured with the promise of hospitality, locked inside a bathhouse and burned alive. At the Drevlians' own capital, she asked for a funeral feast in her husband's honor, waited until wine loosened their laughter, and then had her soldiers slaughter thousands. And when the survivors begged for mercy, she asked only for pigeons and sparrows from each household. They agreed, relieved, until the birds returned home carrying burning cloth tied to their legs, setting the city ablaze in a single, devastating wave. Olga would later embrace Christianity and be canonized, her name forever split between the saint who preached mercy and the widow who reduced an entire city to ash. Centuries later, in Renaissance Italy, Lucrezia Borgia, though never crowned a queen, would rule hearts, politics, and scandal with equal mastery. Born to the infamous Borgia family, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, She was married off multiple times as a pawn in her family's power games. Husbands had a way of disappearing, fleeing, or dying in circumstances polite society called unfortunate. Whispers claimed she wore a hollow ring filled with poison, that she was entangled in her brother Cesari's affairs, even that she had borne a child whose parentage was shrouded in mystery. Whether true or not, the rumors became part of her armor. She spoke several languages, charmed courts, and presided over gatherings where politics mingled with indulgence. Later in life, she traded the chaos for quiet dignity as Duchess of Ferrara, championing the arts and poetry. Yet her name still lingers in history's shadows, half truth, half myth, wholly unforgettable. And then there is Wu Zetian of China's Tang dynasty, who began her life at court as just one more concubine to Emperor Taizong. When he died, she was sent to a Buddhist convent, as tradition demanded for childless concubines. But Wu's ambition didn't fade in the silence. It sharpened. She returned to court by capturing the attention of the next emperor, Gaozong, her former stepson, and stepped back into power. Once empress, she moved with precision. Rivals vanished, threats were exiled or silenced, and her influence deepened until she became the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. Her reign expanded the empire's reach, reformed administration, and fostered culture. Yet she never hesitated to clear the chessboard if it meant securing her position. Even her own children were not beyond suspicion when the balance of power wavered. These women, Maria, Olga, Lucrezia, Wu, did not simply live in history, they bent it toward themselves. Maria's story warns of how love denied can turn into a force that shapes destinies. Olga's firestorm of vengeance reminds you that patience can be as lethal as the sword. Lucrezia's life proves that perception can be as powerful as reality. Wu's rise shows that opportunity belongs to those who can see beyond the rules. As you drift toward sleep, let their faces remain, not as perfect saints or villains, but as women who understood the terrain they walked. In their courts, loyalty was fragile, danger was constant, and survival demanded more than beauty or birthright. It required calculation, will, and the courage to become exactly what the moment demanded. Tonight, they walk with you in the quiet, not to lull you with softness, but to remind you that even in the most dangerous halls, a sharp mind and a steady heart can turn fate itself into a servant. You let the evening settle in, the stillness around you stretching like soft velvet, and step once more into the corridors of history. Those candlelit places where power is rarely gentle, and a crown is never without its thorns. Tonight's queens and courts remind us that authority, once claimed, must be guarded not only against enemies but against the weight of expectation itself. Wu Zetian understood that better than most. She did not hide behind curtains or puppet rulers. She claimed the dragon throne for herself, the only woman in Chinese history to declare herself emperor in her own right. Her path there was a study in precision. Patience when it served her, decisive force when it didn't. Some whispered that she even smothered her infant daughter to frame a rival, a rumor as chilling as it is unproven. But subtlety was never Wu's chosen tool, results were. When Emperor Gaozong weakened, she ruled through him, beside him, and eventually without him. After his death, she stepped fully into the role her critics said she could never hold. Confucian scholars recoiled. Wu ignored them. Under her, the empire's harvests grew richer, schools flourished, and the civil service expanded. And yet, palace corridors remained dangerous. Voices that opposed her sometimes fell silent forever. The accusations that followed were predictable. Lovers in secret chambers, poison in gilded boxes, orgies in hidden halls. Her answer to all of it was endurance. She ruled for over 40 years, dying in her 80s, something few men, and no other women, had ever done from that seat of power. Centuries earlier, in the Kingdom of Georgia, Tamar wore her crown with similar certainty. When she ascended in 1184, she refused to be a mere ornament to male authority. Styled King of Kings, she made it clear that her reign would not be tethered to any man's will. Even when pressured into a politically safe marriage, she chose a Russian prince whose behavior quickly proved unworthy. She dismissed him without hesitation and ruled alone. Her Georgia thrived, Territories expanded, trade routes prospered, and her court became a beacon for art and poetry. One poet, Shota Rustavelli, wrote of a queen so radiant and sovereign she could command any heart. The parallels to Tamar were difficult to ignore. Rumors of her private life danced quietly through the centuries. Hints of discreet companions, retreats beyond the eyes of the court. Whether true or not, the whispers never dimmed her stature. Tamar's legacy survived as both saint and sovereign, proof that a woman could lead crusades, quell rebellions, and still be remembered with reverence. From the guarded intimacy of royal chambers, let's step into the public joy of a medieval winter. In those days, Christmas was not a single morning but a 12-day festival, beginning on December 25th and stretching to the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. The first day was solemn, steeped in liturgy, but after weeks of Advent's restraint, the season burst open with feasts, music, and merriment. For the poor, it was a rare time when meat graced their tables. For the wealthy, the banquets were so lavish they could strain a monastery's treasury. Ale flowed as though the casks were bottomless, and each day held its own meaning. December 26th honored Saint Stephen, a day of almsgiving and charity. December 28th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, sometimes turned households upside down. Children were allowed to rule for the day, with predictably chaotic results. By January 1st, the Feast of the Circumcision, the celebrations blurred into a haze of full bellies and weary voices. The hymns half-sung as roasted goose legs replaced candles in tired hands. The 12th night brought Epiphany, closing the season with processions, pageantry, and the quiet return to ordinary time. And so, whether in the solitude of a throne room or the warmth of a crowded hall, power, be it political or celebratory, was always a performance. Wu Zetian and Tamar remind you that leadership is as much about presence as policy, while the 12 days of Christmas remind you that joy, too, can be an empire in its own right, held not by decree, but by the shared heartbeat of a people. Tonight, as the world outside grows still, carry their lessons with you. The courage to claim your place, the wisdom to hold it, and the grace to let the light linger long after the feast has ended. You close your eyes for a moment and picture it. Not the neat, polished image of Christmas we know today, but something far older, wilder, and alive with both devotion and mischief. For people in the Middle Ages, the season wasn't a single day of wrapping paper and firelight. It was 12 full days, stretching from December 25th to January 6th, pulsing with feasts, pageantry, and the kind of ritual chaos that blurred the lines between sacred reverence and earthy indulgence. It all built toward January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, honoring the Magi's visit to the Christ child. By then, the 12th night celebrations had reached their peak. Masks and disguises transformed faces. Peasants acted as kings while kings pretended to play along. And the world, if only for a few hours, turned itself upside down. A medieval Christmas didn't glisten with pine trees or twinkling electric lights. It looked more like an ancient woodland festival, heavy with greenery and the scent of wood smoke. Evergreen plants, ivy, holly, bay, mistletoe, were pulled straight from the winter forest and carried into halls and homes. They were more than decoration. They were symbols of life that endures through darkness, a tradition borrowed and reshaped from older pagan winter rites. If it stayed green through frost, it was brought inside to hang high above the feasting tables. The centerpiece, however, was not a tree. It was the boar's head, roasted, apple in its mouth, carried into the great hall on a silver dish to the sound of music. Guests would watch as it was paraded in, a symbol of abundance and victory over the lean months. Minstrels sang verses in its honor, their voices rising over the warmth of fire and food. The noble households celebrated in cavernous great halls, where walls were draped in heavy tapestries, rushes scattered across the floor, and music from lutes and pipes wove through the chatter. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting meat, spiced wine, and, if you stood too close to certain guests, the scent of a long winter without baths. Candles cast a golden haze, catching on the gleam of platters and the eyes of those already flushed with drink. Without the later custom of Christmas trees, every branch of greenery had a meaning. Holly's sharp, glossy leaves were said to recall Christ's crown of thorns. Ivy, twisting and clinging, spoke of human dependence on God's grace. Mistletoe carried a wilder reputation, tangled in Norse legend and fertility rites, making the church wary but never stopping those who hung it in doorways for the excuse it offered. A kiss, sometimes welcome, sometimes not. Stepping into such a celebration was like entering a place that was half holy sanctuary, half forest revel. Evergreen boughs arched overhead, candlelight painted everything in amber tones, and long tables groaned beneath the weight of food. In one corner you might find the mistletoe, though you'd better be sure it wasn't the corner hiding the chamber pot. The food was its own declaration of status and celebration. For the nobility, the feast was a stage to display wealth. Roasted peacock in full feather, swan with its skin glazed and redressed, pies so enormous that live birds sometimes flew out when they were cut. Elaborate sugar sculptures shaped like castles or mythical beasts stood alongside steaming platters of goose, venison, and thick stews of root vegetables. For peasants, it was the rare moment in the year they might eat fresh meat and drink their fill. And the drink flowed as freely as the stories. Spiced ale, hot cider, and mulled wine wassail. Passed in shared bowls, the toasts as much a part of the ritual as the prayers. The word itself was a blessing for health, though the next morning might not feel like it. Hippocras, a sweetened spiced wine, warmed chilled bones and softened the edges of days filled with indulgence. But these weren't careless meals. They were choreographed performances of hospitality and order. The highest-ranked guests sat nearest the fire and were served first. Lesser guests waited their turn, unless they were in a monastery, where meals were simpler but rules of equality prevailed. Though even the monks often bent their vows of abstinence for Christmas, carving into mutton or sipping from a jug of wine in honor of the day. For most of the year, ordinary people survived on bread, porridge, and cabbage. At Christmas, the shared agreement was to eat beyond comfort, as though tomorrow's hunger could be kept at bay with one night's feast. And it wasn't just one night. Each of the 12 days brought its own table, its own host, and its own reason to gather. By the time Epiphany arrived, people were full in every sense, body, spirit, and memory, carrying the warmth of those winter halls back into the leaner, quieter days that followed. It was more than celebration. It was a promise, renewed every year, that even in the darkest months, there would be light and life, and a table long enough for all. You might think the holidays today get a little chaotic with awkward dinners, burnt casseroles, and relatives arguing over dessert, but the medieval world would have looked at that and said, "You call that festive?" They had a built-in agent of chaos, the Lord of Misrule. This was an actual recognized role, often given to a fool, a servant, or a particularly cheeky clergyman, whose job was to turn the world upside down for the entire Christmas season. Once crowned, the Lord of Misrule became the master of mischief, presiding over mock courts where criminals were charged with absurd offenses like stealing sausages or wearing the ugliest hat in town. His companions were jesters, musicians, and pranksters, all tasked with pushing the line between celebration and anarchy. For 12 days, social order was flipped. Servants ordered masters about, students punished teachers, and choir boys might be dressed as bishops delivering sermons they could barely pronounce. Even monasteries weren't immune. On St. Nicholas Day, some churches elected a boy bishop to lead processions and offer symbolic wisdom. On the surface, it was hilarious. Underneath, it was a ritual reminder that humility belonged to everyone, even the mighty. The Lord of Misrule encouraged feasting, raucous dancing, drinking games, and outrageous costumes. In noble halls, guests donned animal masks, swapped genders in their attire, or came dressed as saints, sinners, and demons all mingling together. Imagine something like a medieval Halloween, only with more wassail and fewer pumpkins. The church sometimes tried to curb the excess, but they also knew that giving people a place to burn off energy kept the peace. Even bishops enjoyed the occasional fruitcake in the madness. Beyond the great halls, the streets rang with another tradition caroling. Forget the polite, candlelit singing we think of now. Medieval caroling was part music, part demand, and part endurance test. Groups of revelers, often tipsy, would arrive at your door singing loudly and sometimes brandishing tankards or even a goose. The word carol originally meant a song performed in a circle dance, and many early Christmas carols were adapted from folk tunes that weren't exactly holy. Over time, the church reshaped the lyrics to carry religious meaning, but the spirit of the thing remained. Carolers expected payment in the form of food, drink, or coins. Refuse, and they might sing even louder, or improvise a mocking verse about your stinginess. It was festive extortion in its purest form, known as wassailing. The groups would bring a steaming bowl of spiced ale or cider to share as they sang, offering blessings in return for your generosity. Turn them away, and people whispered that you risked bad luck or a poor harvest. The songs varied widely. Some celebrated the nativity, others praised saints, and many were simply about drinking and merriment. Favorites included verses demanding good ale, and the famous boar's head song sung as the roasted head was triumphantly carried into the feast like a trophy from the wild. Carol rounds often spilled past the 12 days, continuing as long as the beer supply held out, sometimes well into January. Inside the manor or farmhouse, another tradition burned brightly, the Yule log. This wasn't a scented candle or a neat little bundle of sticks. It was a massive, solid trunk dragged into the hall with a sense of ceremony. Often so big it wouldn't fit entirely in the hearth, it would be fed into the fire gradually, burning for days. Its flames were more than warmth. They were protection, good fortune, and a quiet oracle for the year ahead. People watched how it burned for signs of luck or omens. The Yule log's roots reached back to older, pre-Christian winter rites, where evergreen life and fire were symbols of endurance through the darkest nights. Lighting it was as much about pushing back unseen dangers as it was about celebrating. Families saved a fragment of the charred wood to light the next year's log, carrying the spark of the old year into the new. So, if you stepped into a medieval Christmas, you'd find a world both strange and familiar. Halls decked in greenery, music spilling into the streets, laughter mixed with reverence, and for 12 days, a sanctioned touch of madness under the watchful eye of the Lord of Misrule. It was part devotion, part carnival, and all a reminder that even in the hardest winters, joy could be loud, unruly, and unforgettable. You can almost feel the heat of the hearth and the glow of candlelight as we step deeper into the heart of a medieval Christmas. A season that balanced merriment with meaning, misrule with devotion. The Yule log was more than just a fire. It was a ritual, a talisman, a living ember from the year before. Families saved ashes from last Christmas and spread them on their fields to bless the soil, or kept them at home to guard against lightning strikes. In a world where storms and famine felt like the will of unseen forces, a blackened scrap of last year's log was both comfort and protection. Lighting the log with new fire was considered unlucky, as though you were shuffling the deck of fate and daring misfortune to draw your name. The log was chosen carefully, sometimes an entire tree cut for the occasion, dressed in greenery, ribbons, or even sprinkled with wine before it met the flames. And it had to burn for all 12 nights. If it went out too soon, well, people muttered about bad omens for the livestock. Gathering around it wasn't just about warmth. It was the season's gathering place. The hearth became the true throne of Christmas. Ale and wassail passed from hand to hand. Chestnuts roasted, gossip and stories rolled between sips. Children were warned of the strange things that might creep down the chimney if they misbehaved. Adults swapped jokes and rumors with pork on their plates and firelight in their eyes. The Yule log may have faded from most homes today, surviving mostly as a chocolate cake. But once, it was the living heart of the season. Gifts, by contrast, were not the star attraction. They came later, often on New Year's Day or Epiphany, time to match local customs or the feast day of a favored saint. These were gestures, not grand unveilings. Nobles might present falcons or books. Servants might receive gloves, food, or, if fortune smiled, a small coin. Children might get nuts or apples, a carved wooden toy if someone was feeling generous. No gold-wrapped boxes, no printed lists, just tokens meant to carry blessing, favor, or remembrance. But the entertainment? That was another matter entirely. The 12 days overflowed with games and contests, each more boisterous than the last. Dice rattled across tables, cards slapped down in triumph, and outdoor sports ended in mud, laughter, and the occasional bruised rib. Games like Hoodman Blind are blind man's bluff, mixed confusion with hilarity. Hot cockles involving blindfolds and slaps was better left unexplained. Wrestling matches broke out in frozen fields, and board games like chess or Alkirk were played with as much strategy as the ale allowed. For those who preferred spectacle, there were mummers' plays, roving troops of masked performers staging chaotic tales of saints, dragons, death, and miraculous return. Improvised, loud, and unpredictable, they were as much a test of the actors' wit as of the audience's sobriety. Riddle contests and charades entertained noble courts, with losers reciting foolish verses or wearing costumes designed for maximum embarrassment. Pig snouts tied to noses, mismatched horns, and other indignities that somehow made the wine taste sweeter. And then, in the midst of all the noise and the laughter, the holy heart of Christmas pulsed steadily. For all the games, for all the roasted boars and wassail, the season was still anchored to the night of Christ's birth. At midnight on December 25th, bells rang across snow-dusted villages and into echoing valleys. Families, whether peasant or noble, wrapped themselves against the winter air and walked together toward the church. The service was lit by candles, their flames flickering against stone walls and painted saints. The smell of incense mingled with the faint scent of damp wool cloaks and frozen earth clinging to boots. Monks' voices rose in slow, resonant chant, weaving Latin prayers into the stillness. Outside, frost sparkled on thatched roofs, and the fields lay silent under the moon, as if the whole world had paused to listen. In that moment, Christmas was both holy day and holiday, a time when feasts and games could coexist with prayer and reverence. And when the service ended, people stepped back into the cold night, their breath steaming in the air, carrying the warmth of the church's light home with them. The revelry would continue for days, but so would the sense that, for a brief stretch of winter, the world was bound together by fire, food, laughter, and the memory of a child born in the dark. You step into the hush of a winter night, the air sharp and scented faintly with wood smoke, and find yourself at the heart of a medieval church. Inside, the space is transformed, garlands of evergreen twist around stone columns. The glow of candles reflects in polished brass, and the sweet haze of incense curls slowly toward the vaulted ceiling. If the choir is in fine form, they chant in rolling Latin that seems to stretch the walls wider. If fortune is less kind, you might hear a few boys trying not to cough up last night's stolen ale. Christmas Day held not one but 3 masses, each with its own meaning. The first, at midnight, honored Christ's eternal birth from the Father. The second, at dawn, marked his birth from Mary. The third, in full daylight, celebrated his birth into the hearts of believers. Symbolism piled upon symbolism, and for the faithful, that meant hours of standing on cold stone floors, shifting from foot to foot as chants, processions, and scripture filled the air. For peasants who rarely saw the inside of a church, this was as much about belonging as belief, a way to touch something eternal before returning to the clamor of feasts and games. Some churches staged nativity plays, complete with Mary, Joseph, shepherds, angels, and occasionally a real baby, though a loaf of bread wrapped in linen worked if no infant could be found or kept from crying. The plays aimed for reverence, but in practice they often invited moments of unintended humor, just as they do today whenever a sheep wanders off stage or a shepherd forgets his line. In a world where life could be cut short by sickness, famine, or war, the Christmas Mass offered a rare stillness, a moment when the year's weight seemed to lift. It was the anchor point in a season of chaos, a reminder of why the celebrations existed at all. And once the prayers ended, there was still one last great feast before the quiet of ordinary days returned. That final crescendo was Epiphany, celebrated on January 6th, marking the arrival of the Magi with their gifts. In the medieval mind, it was nearly as grand as Christmas itself. Churches filled with incense and song, processions wound through the streets, and priests blessed water, homes, and even doorways with holy chalk to guard against evil in the year ahead. It was the last sacred spark before winter's long routine set in. But Epiphany also carried the rowdiest of the 12 days. The 12th night feast brought masks, music, and games to their peak. A dried bean or pea was baked into a cake, and whoever found it became king or queen of the feast, allowed to give playful orders, wear a paper crown, and preside over the revelry. It was part social parody, part cathartic release, and wholly an excuse to shout absurd proclamations between bites of roast meat and slices of fruit-filled cake. For children, Epiphany might be the day of gifts, echoing the Magi's offerings. For adults, it was the last sanctioned day to flirt with a jester, wear a devil mask, or drink until the fire blurred. And when the night ended, the greenery was taken down. The Yule log's last embers were saved for luck, and people stepped back into their regular lives, plowing, praying, and trying to outrun the dangers of the year. The medieval Christmas season was over. 12 days of holy awe, gleeful disorder, and shared humanity. Each year's cycle of joy and misrule folded carefully away until the next. But long before Christmas was bound to Yule logs, mince pies, and carols, another winter celebration reigned. Saturnalia, Rome's festival for Saturn, god of agriculture, time, and the turning of the seasons, began each year on December 17th. What started as a simple rite at Saturn's temple on the Capitoline Hill became one of the most unrestrained, topsy-turvy celebrations in the ancient world. Priests would offer sacrifices and untie the woolen bonds from Saturn's statue, symbolically setting the god free. With that, the normal rules of life loosened. The city slipped into a carnival where power, order, and decorum were temporarily turned upside down. You can almost hear it, the hum of a city that, for once, has decided to put down its tools and silence its endless commands. Saturnalia had begun, and with it came a rare and intoxicating pause in the relentless grind of Roman life. The courts stopped hearing cases, schools locked their doors, shops closed their shutters, and even the Senate, so fond of endless debate, found reasons to stay away. No wars would be declared, no campaigns launched. For a few days, Rome's ever-spinning machine simply rested. But this rest was not quiet. The moment the pause began, the city erupted into laughter, feasts, and the kind of behavior that normally earned stern looks from patricians. Saturnalia was a celebration of inversion, a deliberate turning of the world upside down. Masters served slaves. Senators wore ridiculous hats. Togas were traded for brightly dyed robes called synthesis, the Roman version of leisure wear, loose and colorful, perfect for eating too much and caring too little. The sharp lines of the social hierarchy blurred until, for a fleeting moment, they seemed almost invisible. Freedmen mocked their patrons without fear. Women played the part of men in street performances. Slaves sat at banquet tables, sometimes at the head, while their masters poured them wine. In some homes, the reversal was taken to its most theatrical form. A mock election for the king of Saturnalia, often a slave, whose sole purpose was to command absurdities. "Sing to the goat," he might declare. "Balance your cup on your head and drink without spilling." It was foolishness with ceremony, a rebellion wrapped in garlands, blessed by Saturn himself. The streets shimmered with garlands, wreaths, and the soft glow of candles. No somber hymns rose to the sky, only music, cheers, and the satisfying clatter of dice bouncing across marble. Small gifts changed hands. Wax figurines, trinkets, or playful gag presents known as sigillaria. These weren't about wealth. They were about connection, about the joy of giving without the weight of formality. Saturnalia reminded Rome that time, for these days, belonged not to Caesar's schedules but to Saturn's freedom. For the enslaved, it was the one moment of the year when they could breathe a little easier. They could speak freely, joke at their owner's expense, and dress like citizens. They could imagine, however briefly, what it felt like to be untethered. And for the masters, it was an uncomfortable but necessary reminder: power was not eternal. It existed only so long as the people beneath them agreed to bear its weight. The games of Saturnalia were just as unruly as its feasts. Gambling, normally frowned upon, became not only allowed but encouraged. Men, women, and children clutched dice or knucklebones, betting coins, food, or humiliating dares. Even slaves, usually barred from gambling altogether, joined the fray, sometimes walking away with their master's winnings. In the glow of torchlight, laughter spilled from every corner of the city, drowning out the usual orders and reprimands. It wasn't just fun, it was a release valve for a society built on rigid control. Saturnalia let the powerless push back, even if it was only through jest. And for those at the top, it was a reminder that the world could turn without their permission. But the magic of Saturnalia was always temporary. When the last cup was drained and the final garland pulled down, the city's structure snapped back into place. Orders resumed. Commands were given. Life returned to its usual grind. Yet something lingered, the memory of a world briefly turned on its head, where laughter replaced authority and the walls between people, if only for a moment, came tumbling down. It's that fleeting reversal, that deep sigh of relief before the weight settles back in, that made Saturnalia unforgettable. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, its spirit still whispers through our winter celebrations, reminding us that sometimes, to keep the order of life intact, you first have to let it all fall apart. You can almost picture it. Taverns spilling light and laughter into the streets, private homes transformed into makeshift gambling halls, the sharp click of dice striking marble becoming the season's unofficial music. In Rome, tossing dice during Saturnalia wasn't merely about luck. It was a small act of rebellion. Every throw was like saying aloud, "For this week, I belong to no one. Not even the gods can tell me otherwise." And oh, the wine. It wasn't poured. It flowed, like a river that had finally broken its dam. Cups brimmed with red, deepened with honey, spiced with herbs, sometimes tasting more like medicine than drink, but always consumed in scandalous quantities. No one toasted to moderation here. They drank to Saturn, to liberty, to friendship, and sometimes simply to the joy of seeing the room spin. The streets were alive with music and movement. Drunken singing rang out under the night sky. Public dancing became a spectacle worth stopping for. Wreaths of ivy crowned the heads of those stumbling into fountains, laughter echoing through the cold air. Respectable citizens traded their solemn white togas for bright, flowing robes. Senators strummed lyres in public badly, and no one cared. Women told the bawdiest jokes they could muster, earning cheers instead of scorn. For this short stretch of time, all the virtues Rome usually prized, chastity, restraint, unshakable control, were joyfully thrown aside like crumbs from yesterday's loaf. Many called it the best of days, because it was when people could finally let their masks slip and reveal their truest selves. Messy, loud, emotional, and unapologetically alive. The chaos wasn't seen as shameful. It was necessary, like letting the fields rest before planting again. Saturnalia reminded the Romans that the soul, like the earth, needed its season of wildness. And at the center of this delightful madness stood the king of Saturnalia, the crowned fool with more power than sense. Sometimes called the Lord of Misrule, this temporary ruler was often chosen from the very bottom of society, even a slave. His reign was simple: command disorder. And command he did. Dance like a donkey. Declare your love to that fruit bowl. Quote Cicero, but only while hiccuping. Those who failed to obey didn't face punishment. They faced something worse in Roman culture: public laughter. It was theater with teeth, a symbolic turning of the social order. By crowning the least powerful, Romans reminded themselves, if only subconsciously, that their hierarchy was not unbreakable. The master became the servant, and the servant the master, even if just for one night. The election for king was often decided by hiding a bean or coin in a cake, a tradition that would echo centuries later in winter feasts across Europe. Yet in Rome's older, darker past, the role may have been tied to grim fertility rites, where the mock king's rule ended not with a hangover but with a sacrifice. Thankfully, by the imperial age, the most the king lost was his crown, his pride, and perhaps his memory of the night. When Saturnalia ended, he returned to his old life. The crown passed aside like a half-empty cup of wine. But oh, in those hours of upside-down rule, a slave could issue commands to a senator, and the whole room would cheer. It was a living dream of reversal, a reminder that power was never as permanent as it pretended to be. And then there were the gifts. Forget gold or jewels. Saturnalia gift-giving was about charm and wit, not wealth. The presents, called sigillaria, were small, sometimes absurd, but always full of personality. Wax or clay figurines, little pastries, dried fruits, nuts, or joke items meant to spark laughter more than awe. Some were flattering, some were ridiculous, but all of them carried the same message. In this week of freedom, joy mattered more than status. It was a season where the cheapest trinket could mean more than the grandest treasure, because it was given in the rarest of Roman currencies, the spirit of equality. You can almost feel it, the hum of mischief in the air, the sense that the whole city has agreed to step out of its own skin for a while. Saturnalia gifts were never meant to impress with grandeur. They weren't about flaunting wealth, but about sending a message. I see you. I'm part of this with you. Here's something small, silly, and ours. Sometimes it was sweet, sometimes a little wicked, like the popular phallic charms meant to bring fertility, laughter, and a wink of scandal. Definitely not the sort of thing you'd hand over at an office holiday exchange today, but in ancient Rome, it was practically a blessing. Candles were another favorite. They weren't just practical. They symbolized the return of light after the darkest stretch of the year, an ancient comfort against winter's long nights. Think of them as the Roman version of those bright lamps we use now to keep the winter blues at bay. And then there were handwritten verses or sharp-tongued jokes, because in this week of reversed order, even sarcasm could be a gift worth giving. Children adored Saturnalia. It wasn't just the toys, sweets, and treats. It was the freedom. They could gamble, make jokes at their elders' expense, and even boss the grown-ups around. For a Roman child, it must have felt like stepping into a dream where all the no's had been turned into yes and louder. The gifts might have been modest, but they carried weight. A well-chosen sigillarium could reflect a bond, a joke shared between friends, or simply the amount of wine someone had consumed before picking it out. Some of the wealthiest citizens used gift-giving as a chance to quietly pass out favors or coins to clients, generosity hidden inside tradition. The main rush of presents usually happened around December 19th, right in the thick of the celebrations, and like today, it carried its own mix of joy, expectation, and the occasional forced smile. Oh, another walnut figurine. How inspired! Saturnalia also came with its own dress code, which boiled down to one rule: do the opposite of what you normally would. In a society obsessed with spotless white togas and formal dignity, this was the week for bright party robes, tangled hair, and ivy crowns. The synthesis, a colorful, informal garment usually reserved for private dining, became the uniform of the season. Imagine showing up to a formal banquet in your bathrobe and being applauded for it. Add the pileus, a floppy cap that symbolized freedom, and you had the ancient equivalent of holiday pajamas paired with a Santa hat. The decor matched the mood. Evergreen branches, wreaths and garlands draped homes, temples, and even storefronts. Ivy and holly. Yes, the same plants still woven into our own winter traditions, added their deep greens to the riot of color. Saturnalia was wild, but it was also beautiful. Yet beneath the festivity, there was an undercurrent of cheeky rebellion. Sacred symbols were playfully parroted. Parades featured men dressed as Jupiter or Bacchus, behaving like tipsy jesters. One year, a donkey crowned with laurels led a mock triumph procession simply because, well, Saturn would have approved. Even religion turned upside down. In Saturn's temple, his statue, usually bound in wool to signify restraint, was ceremonially freed. The gods' unbinding mirrored the people's, releasing them from work, from rank, from the rigid machinery of daily life. The streets filled with songs, some joyfully off-key, others downright irreverent, parodying the solemn hymns that normally rose from Rome's sacred spaces. This was, in every sense, a holy festival of unholiness. For 7 days, order was mocked not to destroy it, but to remind people that life was not meant to be lived entirely under the weight of rules. Even in the marble heart of an empire obsessed with power and formality, there was room for joy, for mischief, for a taste of the world as it might have been in some gentler time. Because Saturnalia wasn't just a Roman excuse to drink and gamble, it was rooted in something far older. It carried the memory of a mythical golden age, when Saturn ruled and the earth yielded freely, when no one bowed to a master and no one took up arms against another. No kings, no slaves, just people equal in freedom and abundance. By the time Rome dedicated Saturn's temple in the Forum in 497 BCE, that age had long faded into legend. But once a year, they tried to call it back. The festival began with a sacrifice in the temple, followed by a public banquet where anyone, regardless of wealth or station, could eat their fill. Saturn's statue was unveiled, his bonds cut away, and with that, the people had divine permission to let go. The cosmic order itself had been loosened, and for 1 week, Rome belonged not to law or hierarchy, but to laughter, generosity, and the reckless joy of remembering a world where all were free. You can imagine it, the year's longest night fading, the sun beginning its slow climb back into the sky. In late December, when shadows stretched their farthest, Saturnalia blazed against the darkness with fire, greenery, and the promise of returning light. The candles Romans exchanged weren't just to brighten the home. They were small flames of hope, carrying the quiet belief that winter's reign would not last forever. For all its noise and wine-soaked chaos, Saturnalia also held a sacred whisper, an echo of a time when the world was equal, free, and watched over by gods who walked among mortals. But there was a problem for those who came later. When the early Christian faith began carving out its own winter celebration, it found itself up against the unstoppable force of Roman revelry. Imagine trying to preach humility and spiritual renewal while, across the street, neighbors danced in ivy crowns, tossed dice, and handed out sweets to strangers. People could nod at the sermon and still end up at the party. So the strategy was simple: absorb what you cannot erase. As the empire shifted toward Christianity, Saturnalia began to fade in name but live on in practice. The date of Christmas, set on December 25th, aligned neatly with the festival of the unconquered sun, which itself followed hard on the heels of Saturnalia. Whether this was coincidence or careful planning hardly mattered. What mattered was the seamless transition. Gift-giving, evergreen decorations, candlelight, playful role reversals and pageants, and great feasts all traveled from the old festival into the new holiday. Even the figure of the Lord of Misrule, who presided over medieval Christmas merrymaking, was a direct heir to Saturnalia's mock king. Twelfth Night revelry, raucous and theatrical, carried the same spirit. The exchange of presents around Christmas time still echoed the Roman sigillaria. Even now, you can catch a glimpse of Saturnalia in the laughter of a too-loud family dinner, in the way the holidays give us permission to slow down, to eat and drink more than we should, to step, if only briefly, outside the usual order of things. But the joy was always fleeting. When the final dice roll clicked against the marble, when the last goblet had been drained, the Saturnalia king, half triumphant, half unsteady, set aside his crown. Almost instantly, Rome returned to itself. Masters resumed their authority, slaves returned to service, and the riot of colors gave way to the disciplined white of togas. The transformation was sharp, like someone throwing open the shutters after a night of secret dancing. Saturnalia was never meant to destroy Rome's structure, only to relieve the pressure that built under it. Like steam escaping a bathhouse, the release was necessary to keep the walls from cracking. With the festival's end, Saturn's statue in the temple was once again bound in woolen cords, the visual reminder that cosmic and civic order had been restored. The dream of the Golden Age was folded away like a cherished but impractical garment, waiting for the next winter to be worn again. For the average Roman, the return to order brought different emotions. Some clung to the week's memories, their heads sore and their pockets lighter from lost wagers. Others felt a sense of relief, eager to return to familiar boundaries. For the enslaved, the ending carried a sharper edge. The brief taste of dignity and joy was gone, replaced by the reality of chains. Writers of the time saw both sides. Some scolded the excess, others recorded the meaning beneath it, the strange Roman genius for holding authority in one hand while making fun of it with the other. To rule an empire, yet grant it 7 days to act like a mischievous child, was its own kind of mastery. And Saturnalia, in truth, never truly died. It changed costumes, spoke new languages, and blended with other traditions, but its heartbeat still thumps quietly in our winters. In the glow of candles, in the cheer of a feast, in the playful defiance that says, "For now, the rules can wait." You can still feel the festival spirit, timeless and unbroken. You know this to be true. Every society, no matter how rigid its rules or polished its manners, secretly needs a little disorder. Every year, every calendar, needs a moment when the world tilts on its axis, grins at itself, and admits that rules are only as strong as the people who follow them. But when that brief chaos faded in the medieval world, life returned to something far less forgiving. There were no doctors riding in at the last moment, no clean, whitewashed hospital wards waiting with warm beds. When the hour of birth came, whether in the smoky dimness of a peasant's hut or in the private chamber of a noble lady, it was the midwife who answered the call. Her arrival was rarely announced ahead of time. It could be the middle of the night, in rain or snow, and she would come, moving quickly but with a calmness that steadied the room. She held no official license, no framed certificate. What she carried instead was trust, sometimes fragile, sometimes absolute, and a reputation built on outcomes. In her community, she was more than useful. She was essential. Without her, childbirth was not only agonizing but often fatal. In some villages, she was the only soul who had ever seen multiple births, the one person who knew when to wait, when to act, and when to pray. Even the parish priest, the most authoritative figure in town, stepped aside when she entered. Her hands, though chapped and tired, were the first to touch life and sometimes the last to touch it before it slipped away. Her education was not bound between pages. It was passed from one woman to another, a living chain of knowledge carried through decades. She might have begun as a girl helping an aunt, an older neighbor, or her own mother, laying out cloths, tending the fire, boiling water, and learning in silence. Her first lessons weren't written. They were whispered, demonstrated, and reinforced by the urgency of the moment. Her classroom was a cramped room heavy with the scent of smoke and sweat. Her textbook, the unflinching reality of blood, breath, and pain. Midwives lived in a paradox. Welcomed as saviors when things went well, suspected when they did not. A healthy child and mother meant she was blessed, even beloved. But a stillbirth or fatal bleeding could turn whispers into accusations. People didn't understand infections or hidden complications, but they did understand blame, and someone had to bear it. She learned to navigate this minefield with the same quiet skill she brought to a difficult labor. Superstition was part of her trade, whether she believed in it or not. A chalk circle drawn on the floor, a knife slipped under the bed, a prayer to Saint Margaret murmured under her breath. These were gestures as much for the family's comfort as for any spiritual protection. The midwife knew that fear was as dangerous in the birthing room as any illness, and she would use any tool, sacred or strange, to keep it at bay. Her work had no set hours, no boundaries. She could go from her own hearth to another's bedside in a heartbeat. Nights bled into days, seasons blurred, and there was always the next cry, the next pounding on her door. Yet she was never the tale's heroine. She was the anchor, the steady weight holding the story in place while everyone else weathered the storm. To enter this calling was to step into a lifetime apprenticeship. You didn't become a midwife by theory, but by staying, by choosing again and again, not to turn away from the sight and sound of a life entering the world. Her first solo birth was a trial by fire. If the child cried, if the bleeding slowed, if the mother's eyes stayed open, only then would the village's trust begin to take root. It wasn't only skill that mattered, it was presence. A midwife had to be the calmest soul in the room, even when her own heart raced. She had to act decisively, because hesitation could mean loss. And once the baby was swaddled, the room quieted, and the parents exhaled in relief, she would slip away, her own exhaustion unspoken, her hands already preparing for the next summons. Her tools were humble. A few herbs and oils, clean cloths, a length of cord. No steel instruments, no antiseptic, nothing that would impress a scholar's eye. But in those hands, worn and sure, those simple tools could turn the tide between life and death. And so she carried them everywhere, a quiet guardian of the most dangerous and miraculous moment a household would ever face. You can picture it. The midwife's satchel resting by the door, worn from years of urgent journeys, holding not just tools, but the distilled wisdom of generations. Inside was a curious mixture: remedies from the earth, charms against unseen dangers, and an instinct so refined it bordered on a sixth sense. Her medicine cabinet was made of fields and hedgerows. She knew which leaves could dull the edge of pain, which blossoms could slow a flood of bleeding, and which roots might rouse a reluctant womb to action. Pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow, shepherd's purse, each had its role, whether brewed into teas, pressed into poultices, or burned for their scent. Some healed in ways science would later confirm. Others healed only through the hope they carried. Beside the herbs were swaddling cloths, often steeped in vinegar or wine. She didn't know the word bacteria, but she had learned from experience that certain liquids seemed to ward off worse infections. Small bottles of oil, olive or almond, waited for the moment her hands would ease a tearing muscle or massage a belly to guide the child's descent. A knife or pair of shears, small but sharp, would be ready to free the newborn from the cord. And if the baby's lungs refused to fill, she would act without hesitation, clearing its airways by mouth, rubbing its tiny chest, or even swinging it gently until the first fragile cry broke the silence. Then there were the objects meant to shield against what no herb could touch. Not all welcomed such things, but many mothers insisted. A carved token of St. Margaret might rest near the bed, a talisman for safe delivery. Sometimes the midwife herself wore an amulet under her gown, or quietly pushed iron pins into the mattress straw, silent sentinels to keep dark forces away. These acts were as much for the spirit as for the body. Her greatest tools, though, were her hands and her eyes. She could read a belly's shape like a map, knowing if the child lay true or stubbornly crosswise. She could, with steady pressure, coax a breech baby to turn or shift a laboring woman's position to restart the stalled rhythm of birth. She had no instruments, no measuring devices, only touch, watchfulness, and a memory full of hard-earned patterns. Birth in the medieval world was not a serene affair. It was raw, unpredictable, and closer to the edge of death than most today can imagine. Fires burned in cramped, smoky rooms, their light flickering over the faces of women gathered close. Relatives, neighbors, maybe a servant or two. The birthing mother might squat on a low stool or grip the shoulders of another woman. Men were kept outside. This was women's territory, and here the midwife was sovereign. She watched without distraction. The shift in breathing, the sudden glassiness of the eyes, the subtle change in the cries that told her the pain had deepened into the final struggle. She listened for silence because silence could mean disaster. When urgency struck, she moved with a calm that belied the stakes. A hemorrhage meant her own hands might become the dam against the flood. A baby's stillness called for heat, friction, breath, anything to summon life. Not all stories ended with relief. Stillbirths, mothers who slipped away before dawn. These were truths she carried as part of her craft. When loss came, she did what needed doing. She washed the body, swaddled the child, murmured a prayer over them both. And if the newborn's life was fading before the priest could arrive, she would take on a role the church frowned upon but did not forbid outright. She would baptize the child herself. Wine if there was no water, saliva if there was nothing else. Words spoken softly in the hope that a soul would not wander barred from the light. In that moment, she was more than healer. She was the last bridge between this world and whatever waited beyond. It was a power she carried quietly, a burden she neither flaunted nor refused. She fought not with weapons, but with resolve against pain, against blood loss, against the shadow crouched just outside the threshold. And when she won, when both mother and child breathed freely, it was enough to keep her answering the call again and again. You can almost hear it, the soft but urgent murmur over a newborn's head. I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. It was not her place, not by official decree. Baptism belonged to priests, not women in plain wool gowns. But in the dim hours when life hung by a thread, rules lost their shine. Better to claim a soul for heaven than to watch it slip away untouched. Yet such acts were never without risk. If the child died, baptized or not, and especially if the mother followed soon after, shadows of suspicion lengthened over the midwife. Whispers slithered through the village. Did she give the wrong herb? Did she delay the birth? Was she meddling with darker forces? In an age when faith and fear tangled in the same breath, the border between sacred knowledge and forbidden magic was paper-thin. The tools of her craft, herbs, charms, murmured blessings, were also the seeds of accusation. A woman could save dozens of lives and still find herself doubted after one misfortune. If the baptism failed, or if no baptism was performed, grief could ferment into rage. She might be shunned, stripped of her calling, or summoned before local authorities. For many midwives, especially in towns where superstition burned hot, simply doing their duty meant walking through fire. Still, she returned to the work, because while others argued over theology, she knew the truth. The first cry of a child, the steady breath of a mother, the quiet relief of another life pulled safely into the world. These were the only measures that mattered. The midwife's life was a constant balancing act, poised between the firm hand of the church and the unshakable traditions of women. On one side, priests, rituals, and rules forged in male-dominated halls. On the other, the ancient rhythms of folk wisdom, herbal lore, and the unspoken strength passed from mother to daughter. The church needed her. No priest was going to kneel beside a peasant woman's bed at midnight, but they also feared her. She worked beyond their gaze, made decisions about baptism in their absence, whispered prayers not always in Latin. Some church leaders tried to bind midwives with oaths, swearing they would never use magic, never end a pregnancy, never speak heresy in the birthing room. Others withheld communion or interrogated them if rumors stirred or tragedy struck. But most midwives were neither heretics nor witches. They were practical women facing the raw, unsoftened reality of birth with nothing but their skill, their nerve, and whatever they could carry in a worn satchel. They knew the herbs that could stop a fever, ease pain, or, if chosen, end a pregnancy. They weren't stirring cauldrons under the moonlight. They were boiling water over hearth fires, cutting cords with trembling hands, and standing their ground while the air filled with cries. Still, the fear of witches grew as the 14th century slid toward the upheavals to come. Midwives, with their intimate knowledge of women's bodies, became easy scapegoats. A stillbirth, a deformity, even barrenness. Any of these could spark the question: was it God's will, or did the midwife let the devil in? The irony was bitter. The very practices that guarded women's lives, herbal brews, whispered blessings, protective charms, were the same ones that could see her branded a servant of darkness. So she learned to weave protection for herself as carefully as for her patients. Crossing herself before laying a charm, naming saints while mixing herbs, ensuring every movement could be mistaken for prayer. The birthing room was her realm, one of the few spaces in the medieval world where women's voices outweighed men's. No male entered unless death's shadow fell thick. Inside, heat from the fire pressed against shuttered windows. The air was heavy with steam, candle wax, and the scent of lavender or rosemary meant to soothe the senses. Birth was never solitary. The mother was encircled by her chosen women. A sister, an aunt, a trusted neighbor, perhaps the village healer. These women did more than watch. They steadied the mother's body, massaged her aching back, pressed warm cloths to her skin, and murmured words meant for her alone. Sometimes they sang lullabies, not for the mother but for the child straining toward the light. At the center of it all stood the midwife, directing, guiding, her voice as firm as her hands. She could soothe with a single glance or snap the room to attention with a barked order. She might have to shout above screams, even slap a cheek to draw a woman back from the edge of panic. But she could also weave calm with a touch, a story, or a charm worn smooth by many hands. That circle of women was more than a gathering. It was a shield, woven from shared strength, pain, prayer, and an unspoken vow that in this room, in this moment, they stood together against whatever fate tried to push its way through the door. You can imagine it now. Labor in the medieval world was never just a moment in time. It was a dangerous crossing, and the women gathered in that small, warm room knew it. Every familiar face was a lifeline for the mother straining through pain. Midwives often led the rhythm of the space, not just with skilled hands, but with chants, murmured prayers, or small acts meant to draw protection around the birthing bed. A ribbon tied around a wrist, a candle lit in honor of the Virgin, a splash of wine offered to the earth, a quiet plea to whatever unseen forces might be watching. And when the child finally emerged, wet, loud, gloriously alive, it wasn't only the mother's face that broke into relief. The whole circle responded as one. Tears mingled with laughter. Crosses were traced in the air. Bread might be shared, ale poured, voices rising in joy. In a life where women were often given little control, the birthing room was their rare kingdom, and the midwife was its steadfast guardian, not only over the fragile body of the newborn, but over the invisible bonds between the women themselves. No one became a midwife for wealth. It was work born from endurance, not luxury. The payment, if it came at all, was humble: bread, wool, a jar of ale, or a promise that might vanish if tragedy struck. Many worked without coin entirely, rewarded instead with trust and a place in the community's unspoken hierarchy. In villages, the midwife might be half healer, half helper, summoned at all hours and expected to come without hesitation. In towns, a few gained enough recognition to be named as official parish midwives. But even their pay was small and status fragile. In wealthier places, she might be given candles, wine, or a small pouch of coins. More often, it was a chicken promised after harvest, or a loaf of bread from the next bake. But if a life was lost, the gratitude could sour quickly into silence, or worse, into whispered blame. And yet, for those who persevered, a kind of quiet authority took root. Women trusted her above any priest when the hours grew long and the cries sharpened. Her reputation spread in murmurs. Call her first, before the pains grow stronger. By the late 1300s, some cities began to formalize midwifery, requiring examinations or licenses under the watch of male physicians or church officials. But the title rarely came with better pay, only more oversight, and always the lingering risk of accusation. Still, the midwife endured because her work was never just a task. Every healthy birth was a private triumph, a small but sacred victory that no ledger could record. She did not expect her name to be etched in stone. Most midwives left no mark on history beyond the memories of those they had helped. Many died in the same modest homes they had served from. Their tools and herb bundles passed quietly to an apprentice. Their names might appear in a parish record or a faded legal note, or simply fade away altogether. A few were buried with gratitude, others remembered only in the bitterness of suspicion.